The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor at the exact moment my 7-year-old daughter Emma hit the ground. The sound echoed through the grand ballroom of the Riverside Country Club like a gunshot, silencing 300 wedding guests mid-celebration. But it wasn't the crystal that made my blood freeze. It was the sight of my sister Victoria standing over my child, her perfectly manicured hands still extended from the violent shove, her wedding dress pristine white against the chaos she'd just created. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Emma's flower girl dress, the pale pink silk we'd spent weeks choosing together, was now torn at the shoulder seam. Blood trickled from her scraped palm where she tried to break her fall against the unforgiving stone. Her flower basket lay overturned, white rose petals scattered like snow across the dance floor that moments before had been filled with joy. The silence stretched for what felt like eternity. 300 pairs of eyes switching between my daughter crumpled on the ground and my sister straightening her tiara as if nothing had happened. The orchestra had stopped mid-note. Even the servers froze, champagne bottles hovering over half-filled glasses. I rushed to Emma, my heels clicking frantically against the marble. She wasn't crying. She was too shocked for tears. Her wide brown eyes stared up at me with a confusion that broke something fundamental inside my chest. This was supposed to be magical for her. Her first time being a flower girl. She'd practiced walking down that aisle for weeks, had insisted on sleeping with her flower basket beside her bed. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice so small it barely carried over the resumed murmur of confused guests. "Why did Aunt Victoria push me?" Before I could answer, Victoria's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She was in my way. Not an apology, not even an acknowledgement of what she'd done. Just a flat statement delivered with the same tone she might use to comment on the weather. I told her to move, and she didn't listen. The injustice of it hit me like a physical blow. Emma had been standing exactly where the wedding coordinator had positioned her, waiting for her cue to toss the remaining petals for Victoria's grand entrance back down the aisle. She'd been following instructions, being the perfect flower girl, and my sister had shoved her aside like an inconvenient piece of furniture. I helped Emma to her feet, brushing rose petals from her hair with shaking hands. The scrape on her palm was deeper than I'd initially thought, and I could see the beginning of what would definitely become a spectacular bruise blooming across her left shoulder where she'd hit the marble pillar. "Victoria, what is wrong with you?" The words tore from my throat before I could stop them. "She's 7 years old!" My sister turned toward me with that same cold expression she'd perfected since childhood, the one that said she was the victim here somehow. Her husband Marcus stood beside her, fidgeting with his cufflinks and avoiding eye contact with everyone. The man who'd supposedly loved her enough to marry her couldn't even look at what she'd just done to a child. "Don't be so dramatic, Eliza," Victoria said, adjusting her veil with practiced precision. "Kids fall down all the time, she's fine." But Emma wasn't fine. I could feel her trembling against my side, could see the way she kept glancing between her aunt and the door, as if calculating escape routes. This was the woman she'd been excited to throw flowers for. The aunt who'd promised her a special dance later, who'd let her help choose the wedding cake flavors during the planning meetings. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably. Whispered conversations started up again. Guests unsure whether to pretend they hadn't witnessed what they'd clearly seen or to acknowledge the elephant in the room. I caught fragments of their murmurs. "Did she really just?" And "that poor little girl," and "always knew Victoria had a mean streak." My father appeared at my elbow, his face flushed red above his rented tuxedo collar. But instead of checking on Emma or demanding an explanation from Victoria, he placed a firm hand on my shoulder with just enough pressure to signal a warning. "Let's not make a scene," he said quietly, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority that had defined my childhood. "It was an accident. Kids bounce back. Why don't you take Emma to the bathroom and clean her up? The photographer wants to get some more family shots before dinner." An accident. The word sat in my stomach like a stone. There had been nothing accidental about the deliberate way Victoria had placed both hands on Emma's shoulders and shoved her backward. Nothing accidental about the calculated coldness in her eyes, or the way she'd stepped over my daughter to continue toward her husband without a backward glance. "She pushed her on purpose, Dad." I kept my voice level, though everything inside me was screaming. Emma was standing exactly where she was supposed to be. "You're being dramatic." His dismissive tone was identical to Victoria's, and suddenly I was 8 years old again, being told to stop crying after my sister had accidentally broken my favorite toy. "Victoria's stressed. It's her wedding day. These things happen." Emma tugged on my dress, her small hand leaving a smear of blood on the navy fabric. "Can we go home, Mommy?" she whispered. "I don't want to dance anymore." The defeat in her voice shattered whatever composure I'd been clinging to. This was supposed to be her special day, too. She'd talked about nothing else for weeks: how pretty she'd look, how important her job was, how Aunt Victoria had promised her extra cake. Now she just wanted to leave. Marcus finally stepped forward, his face pale and uncomfortable. "Hey, Emma," he said, crouching down to her level with an awkward smile. "Aunt Victoria didn't mean to hurt you. She's just excited about the wedding. How about we get you some ice cream from the dessert table?" Even though he was doing it. Making excuses. Minimizing what had happened. Trying to buy her silence with sugar. Emma shook her head and pressed closer to my side. "I don't want ice cream," she said politely, because even at 7 she had better manners than the adults surrounding her. "My hand hurts." Victoria let out an exaggerated sigh, as if Emma's pain was somehow an inconvenience to her. "For heaven's sake, it's just a little scrape." I skinned my knees 100 times when I was her age and didn't make such a fuss about it. The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a slap. This wasn't about toughness or resilience. This was about a grown woman refusing to acknowledge that she'd hurt a child, let alone apologize for it. Emma hadn't made a fuss. She'd barely made a sound. She was being braver than most adults would be in her situation. I looked around at the faces surrounding us. My father, stern and dismissive. Marcus, uncomfortable but unwilling to contradict his new wife. The wedding party, frozen in their expensive dresses and rented tuxedos, waiting for someone else to handle the situation. The guests, pretending to be fascinated by their champagne glasses while obviously listening to every word. And Victoria, standing in the center of it all like a queen holding court, completely unmoved by the blood on my daughter's hand or the tears she was finally allowing herself to shed. "We're leaving," I said quietly, my decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "Emma, go get your coat from the coat check." "Eliza, don't be ridiculous," my father snapped. "You can't leave in the middle of the reception. What will people think?" What would people think? Not what people had just witnessed, or how Emma was feeling, or even what kind of person pushed a 7-year-old at their own wedding. Just what would people think about me having the audacity to remove my injured child from a hostile environment? "They'll think I'm protecting my daughter," I said, helping Emma gather the scattered rose petals with her good hand. It seemed important somehow to clean up the mess, even though none of this was our fault. Victoria's laugh was sharp and brittle. "You always were oversensitive, Eliza. Remember when you cried for a week because I accidentally stepped on your sandcastle? Some people just can't handle the real world." The memory she referenced wasn't the one she was describing. I remembered that day clearly. I was 9, she was 11, and she'd deliberately stomped on the elaborate castle I'd spent hours building, grinding the towers into nothing while maintaining perfect eye contact. When I'd started crying, she'd told Mom and Dad that I was being a baby over an accident. Just like now. The pattern was so familiar it made me dizzy. Victoria would do something cruel, claim it was an accident, or that the victim was overreacting, and then somehow emerge as the wronged party, while everyone else worked to smooth things over and restore her comfort. But this time was different. This time it wasn't just me absorbing her cruelty, it was my daughter, and that changed everything. Emma returned with her small pink coat, moving carefully to avoid jostling her injured hand. She'd wrapped her palm in a paper towel from the bathroom, and the blood was already seeping through. The sight of it made my chest tight with rage and protective fury. "Eliza, please," Marcus tried again, his voice taking on a pleading quality. "Don't let this ruin the whole day. We can figure this out. Maybe Emma could be in some of the photos? She looked so pretty walking down the aisle." He meant well. I could see that. But he was still trying to fix this with performance and pictures, instead of addressing the fundamental problem. His wife had just assaulted a child and felt no remorse about it. "The day is already ruined," I said simply, buttoning Emma's coat with gentle fingers. "And not by us leaving, by what happened before we decided to go." Victoria's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Fine, leave then. But don't expect me to pretend this is my fault when you tell everyone your version of what happened." Emma walked into me. I was moving toward Marcus, and she got in the way. That's what actually happened. The gaslighting was so blatant, so calculated that for a moment I couldn't even respond. She was literally rewriting reality in real time, creating a version of events that painted her as the victim and Emma as the clumsy child who'd ruined her perfect moment. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I looked around at the faces watching this exchange. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed to be buying into Victoria's narrative already. I could see them choosing sides, weighing social convenience against moral clarity. "Goodbye, Victoria," I said, taking Emma's good hand in mine. "I hope your marriage is everything you deserve." We walked toward the exit in silence, Emma's small hand warm in mine, her steps careful and measured. Behind us, the reception slowly resumed, conversations restarting, music beginning again, the social machinery grinding back into motion as if nothing significant had occurred. But something significant had occurred, something that would echo far beyond this moment, though I didn't know it yet. Because while my father and sister were busy minimizing and managing and manipulating, there was one person who hadn't spoken yet. One person whose silence was more significant than all their words combined. My mother had been standing near the head table during the entire incident, watching everything with the same sharp attention she'd honed through 25 years in federal law enforcement. Director Sarah Chen Morrison didn't miss details, didn't accept convenient explanations, and didn't tolerate injustice, especially not when it involved her granddaughter. As Emma and I walked toward the exit, I caught a glimpse of my mother's expression in my peripheral vision. She wasn't looking at us leaving. She was looking at Victoria with the kind of cold, calculating stare that had made hardened criminals confess to crimes they'd thought they'd gotten away with. But I was too focused on getting Emma somewhere safe to pay much attention to that look. Too concerned with the way my daughter was holding her injured hand against her chest, too angry about the casual cruelty we'd just witnessed, too heartbroken that what should have been a magical day had turned into another lesson about family dysfunction. I had no idea that my mother was already 3 steps ahead, her mind working through the implications of what she'd just witnessed, with the systematic precision that had made her one of the most feared and respected directors in FBI history. I had no idea that Victoria's perfect wedding day was about to become something else entirely. All I knew was that my daughter was hurt, my family had failed us both, and we were walking away from everything I'd once thought we could trust. The valet brought our car around, and I helped Emma into her booster seat with careful movements. She was quiet during the drive home, staring out the window at the passing trees with the kind of contemplative sadness that no 7-year-old should have to carry. It wasn't until we were pulling into our driveway that she finally spoke. "Mommy," she said in a small voice, "does Aunt Victoria hate me?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Because how do you explain to a child that some people are capable of cruelty without cause? How do you tell your daughter that her aunt had pushed her not out of hatred, but out of something almost worse, complete indifference to her pain? "No, baby," I said, though the words felt hollow. Aunt Victoria was just having a bad day. Emma nodded solemnly, accepting the explanation with the trusting simplicity of childhood. But I could see in her eyes that something had changed. Some fundamental understanding about the world and the people in it had shifted, and I hated Victoria for being the one to teach her that lesson. As I tucked Emma into bed that night, carefully bandaging her scraped palm and checking the bruise on her shoulder, I made a promise. This wouldn't happen again. Whatever it took, however I had to change our family dynamics, my daughter would never again be sacrificed on the altar of keeping peace with people who didn't deserve it. I had no idea how prescient that promise would prove to be, or how dramatically the landscape of our entire family was about to shift. But as I kissed Emma's forehead and turned off her bedroom light, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to dealing with Victoria's cruelty. I felt hope. Because for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't the only witness to what my sister was capable of. And my mother, brilliant, powerful, uncompromising Sarah Chen Morrison, had seen everything. The first text message arrived at 6:47 a.m., barely 12 hours after we'd left the reception. I was in the kitchen making Emma's favorite blueberry pancakes, hoping to salvage some joy from what should have been a special weekend. The notification chimed just as I was flipping the first batch, and I glanced at my phone expecting maybe a work email or a reminder about Emma's dentist appointment. Instead, I saw my cousin Rachel's name on the screen, and my stomach immediately dropped. "Hey Eliza, heard there was some drama at the wedding yesterday. Victoria's pretty upset about you leaving early. Hope you're okay." Drama. Such a sanitized word for what had actually happened. I set down the spatula and stared at the message, realizing with growing dread that Victoria's version of events was already making its way through our extended family's gossip network. Before I could even respond to Rachel, another message popped up, this one from my Aunt Margaret. "Eliza, honey, Victoria called me this morning. She's devastated that you left her wedding over such a small misunderstanding. Kids bump into adults all the time at parties. Maybe you could call her and smooth things over?" Small misunderstanding. Kids bump into adults. The revision of reality was already in full swing, and Victoria hadn't even waited for the honeymoon to begin her campaign. Emma wandered into the kitchen in her pajamas, her injured hand held carefully against her chest. The bandage I'd applied the night before was already starting to fray at the edges, and I could see the purple bruise on her shoulder peeking out from under her sleeve. "Are those for me, Mommy?" she asked, eyeing the pancakes with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since yesterday. "They absolutely are, sweet pea," I said, forcing brightness into my voice as I slid a stack onto her plate. "Extra blueberries, just like you like them." She climbed onto her booster seat with careful movements, still favoring her injured side. Watching her navigate breakfast with one functional hand while trying to pretend everything was normal broke my heart all over again. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. "Eliza, we need to talk. Your mother and I are coming over this afternoon. This situation with Victoria needs to be resolved before it gets out of hand. Family comes first." Family comes first. The Morrison family motto, wielded like a weapon whenever someone dared to suggest that accountability might be more important than maintaining the illusion of harmony. I turned the phone face down on the counter, not ready to deal with whatever narrative management my parents had planned. Emma was chattering about a dream she'd had about flying horses, syrup dripping down her chin, and for a few precious minutes I could pretend we lived in a world where 7-year-olds didn't get pushed down by their own aunts at weddings. But reality has a way of intruding, and by 10 a.m. my phone was buzzing constantly with messages from various family members who'd apparently received their talking points from Victoria's damage control campaign. "Cousin James. Heard you had a rough time at the wedding. Victoria feels terrible about the accident. She's hoping you can forgive her." "Great Aunt Susan. Eliza dear, weddings are stressful for everyone. I'm sure Victoria didn't mean to bump into Emma. These things happen when there are lots of people around. Uncle Robert, your sister's in tears about this whole thing. She loves Emma so much. Can't we all just move past this?" The gaslighting was systematic and thorough. Victoria had clearly spent the morning after her wedding night calling family members with a carefully crafted version of events that painted her as the victim of my overreaction rather than the perpetrator of child abuse. In her version, there was no violent shove. Emma had simply gotten in the way during a busy moment, and Victoria had, quote, accidentally bumped into her while trying to move through the crowd. The injury to Emma's hand had been caused by her own clumsiness in falling, not by the force of being pushed backward into a marble pillar. And my decision to leave had been a dramatic overreaction that had embarrassed the entire family and ruined Victoria's special day. The most insidious part was how believable this version sounded to people who hadn't been there. Weddings were chaotic, kids did get underfoot, accidents happened. And everyone knew I'd always been sensitive when it came to Victoria, a characterization that had been carefully cultivated over decades of similar incidents. Emma finished her breakfast and went to watch cartoons in the living room, leaving me alone with my buzzing phone and growing rage. I scrolled through message after message, each one a small knife twist of invalidation and gaslighting. The worst part was that I could see it working. Family members who'd known Victoria her entire life, who'd witnessed her capacity for calculated cruelty firsthand, were buying into her victim narrative because it was easier than confronting the uncomfortable truth about who she really was. By noon, I'd received 17 messages from different relatives, all variations on the same theme. Victoria was sorry. It was an accident. I was overreacting. Family harmony needed to be restored. Not a single person had asked how Emma was feeling or whether her injuries were healing properly. That's when my mother called. I almost didn't answer. I wasn't ready for whatever lecture about family loyalty she and my father had prepared. But something in me couldn't ignore a call from Sarah Chin Morrison, even when I was furious with her for enabling Victoria's behavior for so many years. "Hello, Mom." "Eliza." Her voice was crisp and professional, the tone she used during FBI briefings rather than family conversations. "I've been getting interesting phone calls all morning." "Let me guess," I said, watching Emma color carefully with her good hand through the doorway. Victoria's been working the phones, spreading her version of what happened yesterday. Among others, yes. There was something in my mother's tone that I couldn't quite identify. "I've spoken with your father, your Aunt Margaret, and several of your cousins. It seems there's quite a bit of confusion about what actually occurred at the wedding." Here it comes, I thought. The gentle but firm suggestion that I apologize to Victoria for the sake of family peace. The reminder that weddings are stressful and accidents happen. The subtle implication that I was being dramatic and oversensitive. "Mom, I know what you're going to say, but—" "Do you?" she interrupted, and there was something sharp in her voice that made me pause. "Because I'm not sure you do. Tell me something, Eliza. In all these phone calls I've been receiving, has anyone asked you for your account of what happened?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said slowly, "that I've heard Victoria's version from 6 different people this morning. I've heard your father's interpretation, and your Aunt Margaret's analysis, and even your cousin James's opinion about wedding stress and family dynamics. But not one person has asked you to describe what you actually witnessed." I opened my mouth and then closed it again, realizing she was right. Every conversation had started with Victoria's narrative as the established truth, and I'd been put in the position of defending myself against accusations of overreaction rather than being asked to simply describe what had occurred. "That's interesting, don't you think?" my mother continued. "From an investigative standpoint, it suggests a coordinated effort to establish a particular version of events before contrary evidence can be properly examined." The clinical way she was analyzing the situation made something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't my mother, the grandmother, speaking. This was Director Chen Morrison, the federal investigator. "Mom, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that in my experience, innocent people don't usually launch immediate PR campaigns to control the narrative. They simply tell the truth and trust that reasonable people will see it for what it is." Through the window, I could see my father's car pulling into the driveway. He was alone, which was unusual. My parents typically presented a united front during family crisis management sessions. "Dad's here," I said into the phone. "Yes, I sent him. We need to discuss some things, and I thought it would be better if he came alone first." There was a pause. "Eliza, I want you to know that what I witnessed yesterday was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. And it was not your daughter's fault." The simple validation hit me like a physical relief. "Thank you," I whispered. "Don't thank me yet," she said quietly. "Thank me after we've finished dealing with this situation properly." The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Through the living room window, I could see my father approaching the front door with the purposeful stride he used when he had unpleasant tasks to complete. "Emma, sweetie," I called. "Grandpa's here." She looked up from her coloring book with immediate worry. "Is he mad about yesterday?" The fact that a 7-year-old's first concern was whether she was in trouble for being assaulted told me everything I needed to know about the family dynamic she'd already learned to navigate. No, baby, I said firmly. You didn't do anything wrong. Remember that, okay? My father knocked once and entered without waiting for an answer, a habit that had always annoyed me but which I'd never felt empowered to challenge. He looked older than he had yesterday, his face drawn and his usually perfect silver hair slightly disheveled. Eliza? He nodded at me stiffly, then moved toward Emma with forced brightness. How's my favorite granddaughter this morning? Emma held up her bandaged hand solemnly. It still hurts, Grandpa. He winced slightly, the first crack in his composed exterior. Well, these things happen, sweetheart. You'll be good as new in no time. These things happen. Even to Emma's face, he couldn't acknowledge that these things didn't happen randomly. They were done by specific people making specific choices. Emma returned to her coloring, and my father gestured toward the kitchen. We sat across from each other at the breakfast table, the morning light harsh against his tired features. This needs to stop, Eliza, he said without preamble. The whole family's in an uproar. Victoria's beside herself. Marcus is furious. Your mother's been making phone calls all morning that have everyone walking on eggshells. What kind of phone calls? I asked, remembering the strange tone in my mother's voice. He waved his hand dismissively. The kind that makes people nervous. Look, we all know your mother can be intense when she thinks someone in the family has been wronged. But this isn't a federal case, it's a family misunderstanding that needs to be handled quietly. Quietly. Always quietly with the Morrisons. Never mind justice or accountability or protecting children. What mattered was maintaining the facade of respectability. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Dad. Victoria deliberately pushed Emma. Hard, I saw it happen. You saw what you expected to see, he said wearily. You've been carrying grudges against your sister since you were children. Every minor incident gets blown out of proportion in your mind. The casual dismissal of my perception, my memory, my credibility stung like a slap. Minor incident? Emma has a bruised shoulder and a cut hand. Kids get hurt. They heal. What doesn't heal is family relationships destroyed by stubbornness and pride. He leaned forward, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he'd used throughout my childhood to convince me that my reality was wrong. Victoria called me in tears this morning. She's devastated that you think she would intentionally hurt Emma. She loves that little girl. People who loved children didn't push them into marble pillars, but pointing that out would only lead to more lectures about my oversensitivity and tendency to assume the worst about Victoria. Has anyone asked Victoria to apologize? I asked instead. My father looked genuinely confused by the question. Apologize for what? For an accident that happened in a crowded room during a stressful event? For pushing Emma, for not checking if she was hurt, for not showing any concern or remorse. She feels terrible about the accident, he insisted, but she's not going to grovel for something that wasn't her fault. There it was, the fundamental difference in our perception of what had occurred. In his mind, Victoria bore no responsibility for Emma's injuries because the push had been reclassified as an accident, which meant no apology was necessary, and my continued anger was unreasonable. My phone buzzed with another text message. This one was from Victoria herself. Eliza, I can't believe you're dragging this out and making everyone choose sides. I'm sorry Emma got hurt, but it was not my fault. If you can't accept that, then maybe we need some space from each other. I showed the message to my father, watching his expression as he read Victoria's non-apology, apology, and implicit threat to cut off contact unless I accepted her version of events. See? He said, handing the phone back. She's trying to reach out. She's sorry Emma got hurt. That should be enough. But it wasn't enough. Sorry Emma got hurt was not the same as sorry I hurt Emma. It was the language of natural disasters and unavoidable accidents, not personal responsibility and genuine remorse. Dad, if I pushed you down right now and then said I was sorry you got hurt, would that sound like a real apology to you? He stood up abruptly, clearly done with the conversation. This is exactly the kind of dramatic comparison that makes everyone tired of dealing with you, Eliza. Victoria's your sister. Emma is fine. Your mother needs to stop making federal cases out of family disagreements, and you need to decide whether you want to be part of this family or not. The ultimatum hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. accept Victoria's narrative and resume normal family relations, or be cut off from the Morrison clan entirely. It should have been an easy choice. I'd been managing Victoria's cruelty and my family's enabling of it for decades. I knew how to swallow my anger, minimize my hurt, and maintain the peace. I knew how to sacrifice my own sense of justice for the comfort of people who'd never done the same for me. But this time, Emma was involved. This time, my compliance wouldn't just mean accepting my own mistreatment. It would mean teaching my daughter that adults could hurt her without consequences as long as they were family. "I need to think about it," I said finally. My father's expression softened slightly, misreading my hesitation as capitulation. "Good, take some time, cool down. Your mother's intensity will blow over if we handle this right." "But Eliza?" He paused at the kitchen doorway. "Don't let pride destroy what's left of this family. Some things matter more than being right." After he left, I sat alone at the breakfast table staring at Victoria's text message. The manipulation in it was breathtaking, portraying herself as the victim of my unreasonable anger, while simultaneously threatening to withdraw her presence from our lives, as if that would be a punishment rather than a relief. Emma appeared in the doorway, still clutching her coloring book. "Mommy, why was Grandpa's voice loud?" Even she had noticed the tension, the barely controlled frustration in his tone. I pulled her onto my lap carefully, mindful of her injuries. "Grandpa's worried about the family," I said honestly. "Sometimes when grown-ups are worried, they get loud." She nodded solemnly, then looked up at me with those wise brown eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "Are you worried too?" I was. I was worried about Emma's physical healing and her emotional recovery. I was worried about the precedent we'd set if we let Victoria's assault go unanswered. I was worried about my mother's mysterious phone calls and my father's ultimatums and the growing pressure to choose between truth and family harmony. But mostly I was worried that Emma was learning the same lesson I'd learned at her age, that her pain mattered less than other people's comfort, and that speaking up about injustice would make her the problem rather than the solution. "A little," I admitted, "but worrying is just part of taking care of people you love." She seemed satisfied with that answer and returned to her coloring. I watched her work, her small tongue poking out in concentration as she carefully stayed within the lines with her uninjured hand. My phone buzzed again. Another family member, another gentle suggestion that I was overreacting. Another subtle pressure to apologize to Victoria for the disruption I'd caused by leaving her wedding after she'd assaulted my child. But something had shifted during my conversation with my mother. For the first time in decades, I had an ally who'd witnessed Victoria's cruelty and was willing to call it what it was. Someone with the power and authority to cut through the gaslighting and manipulation that had defined my family relationships for as long as I could remember. I didn't know what director Sarah Chen Morrison was planning, but I was beginning to suspect that Victoria's campaign to control the narrative was about to meet its match. The real question was whether I was ready for whatever came next. Because once you stop accepting the family mythology and start insisting on truth, there's no going back to the comfortable lies that kept everyone happy. As Emma colored her pictures and I fielded increasingly desperate messages from relatives trying to broker peace, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to apologize, I wasn't going to accept Victoria's non-apology. And I wasn't going to teach my daughter that family loyalty meant accepting abuse. Whatever the consequences, Emma deserved better. And maybe, finally, so did I. The black SUV pulled into Victoria and Marcus's driveway at exactly 7:15 a.m. on Tuesday morning, 3 days after the wedding. I know the precise time because my mother had texted me 15 minutes earlier with a simple message. "Stay close to your phone, things are about to change." Victoria was still in her silk robe, probably sipping coffee and planning another round of phone calls to family members, when the doorbell rang. Through my mother's later account, I learned that Marcus answered the door expecting maybe a delivery driver or a neighbor borrowing sugar. Instead, he found himself face-to-face with FBI Director Sarah Chen Morrison in full professional attire, charcoal suit, federal badge clearly visible, and an expression that could freeze lava. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made seasoned agents straighten their spines, "I need to speak with Victoria immediately." Marcus, to his credit, tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Sarah, hi, She's still getting dressed. Maybe you could come back later. We're still recovering from the wedding, and— This isn't a social call, my mother interrupted, stepping past him into the foyer with the confidence of someone accustomed to entering spaces, whether invited or not. And it's Director Morrison, while I'm conducting official business. The distinction wasn't lost on Marcus. This wasn't Grandma Sarah coming for coffee and conversation. This was the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, arriving unannounced at their home, and the implications of that shift were clearly starting to dawn on him. Victoria appeared at the top of the stairs, still fussing with the belt of her robe. "Sarah, what are you doing here so early? If this is about Sunday, I really don't think." "Come downstairs, Victoria. Now." The command was delivered with the same tone my mother used to order raids on organized crime compounds. "We have things to discuss." I can only imagine the look that passed between Victoria and Marcus in that moment. The sudden realization that their carefully orchestrated narrative campaign might not be as successful as they'd thought. The cold understanding that they were no longer dealing with family dynamics but with federal law enforcement. Victoria descended the stairs with obvious reluctance, her usual confident demeanor replaced by something approaching caution. She'd spent 3 days painting herself as the victim of my overreaction. But now she was facing the one person in our family who couldn't be manipulated, gaslit, or intimidated. "Sarah, I don't appreciate you barging into our home like this," Victoria began, trying to reclaim some control over the situation. "If you want to discuss what happened at the wedding, we can do that like civilized adults." My mother's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Civilized adults don't assault children at wedding receptions, Victoria. But let's discuss that, shall we?" She opened a leather portfolio and removed what appeared to be photographs, high-resolution prints, that she spread across their granite kitchen island with methodical precision. "These," she said, pointing to the first image, "are screenshots from security footage. The Riverside Country Club has an extensive surveillance system, did you know that? 24 cameras covering the ballroom from multiple angles." Victoria's face went white. "You can't just—" "Actually, I can." My mother's voice remained perfectly level. "The club management was very cooperative when I explained that we were investigating an incident involving child endangerment. Amazing how helpful people become when federal badges are involved." She pointed to the second photograph. "This angle shows you approaching Emma from behind. Notice how she's standing exactly where the wedding coordinator positioned her, holding her flower basket, waiting for her cue." The third photo captured the moment of impact. "Here we see your hands making contact with my granddaughter's shoulders. The force analysis indicates approximately 47 pounds of pressure applied in a downward and backward trajectory." Marcus made a strangled sound. "Force analysis? Sarah, this is insane. It was an accident at a family gathering." "Director Morrison," she corrected again, her gaze never leaving Victoria's increasingly pale face. "And forensic analysis of assault incidents is standard procedure in cases involving minors." The fourth photograph showed Emma hitting the marble pillar. "Impact velocity consistent with significant applied force. Note the angle of impact and the resulting injuries to the victim's palm and shoulder." Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out higher and more strained than usual. "This is ridiculous. You're treating a minor misunderstanding like some kind of criminal case." "Minor misunderstanding?" My mother's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that what we're calling the deliberate physical assault of a 7-year-old child?" "I didn't assault anyone." Victoria's voice cracked with desperation. "She was in my way. I was trying to get to Marcus for photos and she wouldn't move." The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Marcus closed his eyes as if he could somehow unhear his wife's words, while my mother simply nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd just obtained exactly the confession she'd been seeking. "So you're confirming that you deliberately pushed Emma because she was in your way?" My mother's tone remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. "And you considered a 7-year-old child standing where she'd been instructed to stand an obstacle worthy of physical removal?" "That's not—" "I didn't mean—" Victoria stumbled over her words, finally realizing she'd walked directly into a trap. "Let me be clear about something," my mother continued, gathering the photographs back into her portfolio. I've spent 25 years investigating crimes against children. I've seen every type of abuse, every form of justification, every brand of excuse. What you did to Emma wasn't an accident, wasn't a misunderstanding, and wasn't acceptable. She stood to her full height, and despite being several inches shorter than Victoria, she somehow seemed to tower over her daughter-in-law. I've also spent the last 3 days documenting your campaign to gaslight the family about what happened. The coordinated phone calls, the manufactured narrative, the systematic pressure on Eliza to accept your version of events. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through what appeared to be detailed notes. 17 different family members contacted with substantially identical talking points. That level of coordination suggests premeditation and consciousness of guilt. Victoria's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Marcus stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Sarah, Director Morrison, I think maybe we should all calm down and—" "Mr. Hamilton," she interrupted, using Marcus's surname with the same cold formality she'd use with a suspect. "Are you aware that failure to report child abuse is a federal crime when it occurs across state lines? Your silence and complicity in covering up this incident could constitute accessory charges." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus went even paler than his wife. "Now," my mother continued, "let me explain what's going to happen next. Victoria, you're going to call Eliza and offer a full, unqualified apology for assaulting Emma. You're going to acknowledge that your actions were deliberate and wrong, and you're going to accept full responsibility for Emma's injuries." "I'm not going to." "Yes, you are." The command cut through Victoria's protest like a blade. "Because if you don't, I'm going to do several things that will make your current situation look like a pleasant misunderstanding." She began counting off on her fingers with the precision of someone laying out a case to a grand jury. "First, I'm going to forward this evidence to the local district attorney's office with a formal request for assault charges against a minor. The video evidence is unambiguous, and your recorded confession to me this morning will support the prosecution's case." Victoria's knees seemed to buckle slightly. Marcus reached out to steady her. "Second, I'm going to ensure that every family member who participated in your gaslighting campaign understands exactly what they were enabling. The same surveillance footage that shows your assault also captures the reactions of various family members, including their failure to render aid to an injured child." The implications of that statement hit both of them simultaneously. Not only had Victoria been caught on camera committing assault, but everyone who'd minimized it or made excuses afterward could potentially face scrutiny for their roles in the cover-up. "Third," my mother continued relentlessly, "I'm going to have a very interesting conversation with your employer, Victoria. Wasn't it the Children's Hospital Foundation where you work in public relations? I imagine they'd be fascinated to learn about their employees' approach to child welfare." Victoria's job, I hadn't even thought about the professional implications, but my mother clearly had. Working for a children's charity while being investigated for child assault would be a career-ending contradiction. "Fourth, I'm going to make sure this story reaches every relevant professional network, social media platform, and community organization where you've cultivated your reputation as a caring, family-oriented person." The systematic destruction of Victoria's carefully crafted public image would be devastating. She'd built her social identity around being the successful sister, the perfect wife, the generous philanthropist. Having that facade torn away in public would be a humiliation she'd never recover from. "And finally," my mother said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I'm going to make sure that every law enforcement database in the country contains a detailed record of this incident, so that if you ever harm another child, mine or anyone else's, there will be a documented pattern of behavior that prosecutors can reference." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria was shaking now, whether from rage or fear, or the sudden recognition of how completely she'd underestimated her opponent. "You can't do this," she whispered. "I'm family." "Family doesn't assault children," my mother replied without a trace of emotion. "Family doesn't gaslight victims. Family doesn't coordinate cover-ups to protect abusers. You stopped being family the moment you put your hands on my granddaughter." Marcus finally found his voice. "What do you want from us?" I want Victoria to understand that there are consequences for her actions. I want her to publicly acknowledge what she did and take responsibility for it. And I want to ensure that Emma never has to be in the same room as her aunt again, unless and until Victoria demonstrates genuine remorse and meaningful change. She closed her portfolio and straightened her jacket. You have until 5 p.m. today to call Eliza with your apology. Make it genuine, complete, and unconditional. If I don't receive confirmation from my daughter that she's satisfied with your response, I'll proceed with the alternatives I've outlined. Victoria's voice was barely audible. And if I do apologize, what then? Then you'll have begun the process of facing the consequences of your choices like an adult, instead of hiding behind family loyalty and manufactured victim narratives. My mother moved toward the door, then paused. But understand this, Victoria. Your relationship with Emma is over. You've demonstrated that you're willing to harm her for your own convenience, and I will never allow you to have that opportunity again. You can't keep me away from my own niece. The desperation in Victoria's voice was palpable, but my mother's response was ice cold. Watch me. With that, she left them standing in their kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of their carefully constructed narrative, and facing the reality that their actions had consequences beyond family drama. My phone rang 20 minutes later. It was my mother, and she sounded tired but satisfied. It's done, she said simply. Victoria will be calling you this afternoon. Mom, what did you do? What I should have done years ago, she replied. I stopped allowing family loyalty to override basic human decency. Emma deserves better than we've given her, and so do you. The call from Victoria came at 4:47 p.m., 13 minutes before my mother's deadline. Her voice was different, smaller somehow, stripped of the confident authority she usually wielded. Eliza, it's Victoria. I want to apologize. The words came out stilted and rehearsed, but they came. A full acknowledgement of what she'd done, acceptance of responsibility for Emma's injuries, and recognition that her behavior had been wrong and inexcusable. It wasn't perfect. I could hear the resentment underneath, the anger at being forced into accountability, but it was more than I'd ever gotten from her before, and more than I'd ever expected to receive. When she finished, I said simply, "Thank you for the apology, Victoria. I hope you mean it." I do, she said, though we both knew that remained to be seen. After the call ended, I sat in my kitchen thinking about power and justice, and the strange ways that protection can arrive when you least expect it. For 34 years, I'd accepted that Victoria's cruelty was just part of the family dynamic, something to be endured rather than challenged. But my mother had shown me something different. She'd demonstrated that love sometimes looks like drawing hard lines, that protection sometimes requires the willingness to destroy comfortable lies, and that real family loyalty means protecting the vulnerable rather than enabling the powerful. Emma came into the kitchen while I was lost in thought, her bandaged hand much better but her cautious movements still betraying the memory of Sunday's trauma. "Mommy, was that Aunt Victoria on the phone?" "Yes, sweetie. She called to apologize for hurting you." Emma considered this with the serious expression she wore when processing difficult concepts. Did she mean it? Out of the mouths of babes. The same question I'd been asking myself. "I think she's beginning to understand that what she did was wrong," I said carefully. "But it's going to take time to know if she really means it." Emma nodded and returned to her coloring book, apparently satisfied with that answer. But I knew that regardless of Victoria's sincerity, something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamics. The age of consequence had begun, and there was no going back. The manila envelope arrived by courier at 9:23 a.m. on Thursday, 2 days after Victoria's forced apology. Emma was at school, and I was working from home when the doorbell rang. The delivery driver handed me a thick package marked "Confidential, Recipient Only," in my mother's precise handwriting. Inside, I found documents that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The cover letter was typed on FBI letterhead, but the tone was purely maternal. "Eliza, what happened to Emma made me realize I've been protecting the wrong people for far too long. The enclosed information represents 23 years of documentation I never thought I'd need to use. After watching Victoria gaslight you and our entire family this week, I've decided that some secrets are more dangerous than the truth. Read everything before you call me." Love, Mom. My hands trembled as I opened the first folder, labeled Morrison Family Incident Reports, 1999 to 2022. What I found inside was a meticulous chronicle of Victoria's pattern of abuse, documented with the thoroughness of a federal investigation. Police reports, medical records, school incident files, witness statements, all carefully compiled and preserved by my mother over more than 2 decades. The earliest entry was dated September 15, 1999. I was 11, Victoria was 13, and according to the emergency room report, I'd arrived at Children's Hospital with a dislocated shoulder and multiple contusions. The official story, which I remembered clearly, was that I'd fallen down the basement stairs. But attached to the medical report was something I'd never seen before. A handwritten note from the attending physician expressing concern about the injury pattern, which was inconsistent with a typical fall. Dr. Patricia Williams had noted that my shoulder had been dislocated with significant force applied from behind, and that the bruising on my upper arms showed finger-shaped marks consistent with someone grabbing and twisting. She'd questioned me privately about what had really happened, but I'd stuck to the story Victoria had coached me to tell. At the time, I'd believed Victoria's explanation that no one would believe her version, that she'd been trying to help me carry laundry down the stairs when I'd tripped. She'd been so convincing, so concerned, so seemingly traumatized by my accident, that I'd felt guilty for even wondering if she'd pushed me. But Dr. Williams hadn't been convinced. She'd filed a report with Child Protective Services expressing her suspicions. The CPS investigation that followed had been brief and inconclusive. Victoria was a model student, our parents were respected members of the community, and I'd maintained the accidental fall story despite gentle questioning. The case had been closed, but my mother had kept every document. The second folder contained school records I'd never known existed. Report after report from teachers, counselors, and administrators documenting Victoria's behavior toward other students. A pattern emerged that was sickeningly familiar: calculated cruelty disguised as accidents, systematic targeting of smaller or more vulnerable children, and an uncanny ability to avoid consequences by manipulating adult perceptions. Mrs. Henderson, our 4th grade teacher, had written a detailed memo about an incident where Victoria had accidentally spilled red paint on another student's art project minutes before the school art show. The memo noted that Victoria had seemed to enjoy the other child's distress and had made no effort to help clean up or apologize. Mr. Thompson, the middle school principal, had documented multiple incidents of Victoria accidentally bumping into younger students in the hallways, causing them to drop books or fall down. When questioned, Victoria had always expressed concern and offered to help, but several teachers had noted that she seemed to target the same vulnerable children repeatedly. The most disturbing entry was from high school. Victoria had been 17, serving as a peer tutor for special needs students. Ms. Garcia, the special education coordinator, had filed a formal complaint after witnessing Victoria deliberately knock over a wheelchair-bound student's water bottle, then publicly make a show of helping clean up, while quietly taunting the student about their clumsiness. The complaint had been dismissed after Victoria's tearful explanation that she'd been trying to reach something on a high shelf and had accidentally bumped the wheelchair. But Ms. Garcia had documented her observations that Victoria had calculated the incident to occur when other adults weren't in direct line of sight, and that her subsequent helpful behavior had included whispered comments designed to humiliate the victim. Each incident followed the same pattern: deliberate harm disguised as an accident, public displays of concern covering private cruelty, and systematic targeting of those least able to defend themselves or be believed by adults. But it was the third folder that left me sitting in stunned silence on my living room floor. This one was labeled Victoria Morrison Hamilton Adult Incidents and contained documentation from Victoria's college years through the present. My mother had somehow obtained reports from her sorority, her employers, her volunteer organizations, and even her homeowners association. The sorority incident from her junior year was particularly chilling. Victoria had been accused by 3 different pledges of deliberate hazing activities that went beyond the organization's approved initiation rituals. One young woman had required emergency medical treatment after Victoria had accidentally served her food containing an allergen she'd specifically been told about during pledge interviews. When questioned, Victoria had produced a detailed explanation about how she'd confused one pledge's dietary restrictions with another's, complete with handwritten notes and a timeline that seemed to support her story. The investigation had concluded that the incident was a tragic mistake caused by poor communication and stress. But attached to the official report was a private letter from the sorority's faculty advisor, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, expressing her belief that Victoria had deliberately targeted the allergic pledge as retaliation for the young woman's reluctance to participate in unofficial hazing activities. Dr. Martinez had documented several instances of Victoria's behavior that suggested a concerning pattern of calculated cruelty disguised as incompetence. The workplace incidents were equally disturbing. At her first job out of college, working for a nonprofit literacy organization, Victoria had been involved in 3 separate incidents of accidental damage to materials being prepared for underprivileged children's programs. Computer files had been corrupted, supply orders had been canceled, and event schedules had been mistakenly changed, causing significant setbacks to programs serving vulnerable populations. Each time, Victoria had appeared genuinely distressed by the problems and had worked overtime to help fix the damage she'd secretly caused. Her supervisor's evaluation had praised her dedication and problem-solving skills, noting how she always seemed to be the first person to discover problems and the most committed to finding solutions. But a janitor named Carlos Rodriguez had filed an informal complaint with HR about overhearing Victoria on a phone call laughing about those little brats and how easy it was to mess with their reading programs. His report had been dismissed as hearsay from a disgruntled employee, but my mother had somehow tracked him down years later and obtained a signed statement detailing what he'd witnessed. The pattern continued through every job, every volunteer position, every organization Victoria had been part of. She had an uncanny ability to create problems for vulnerable populations while positioning herself as their dedicated advocate. Children's programs suffered mysterious setbacks that Victoria heroically worked to resolve. Elderly residents at the nursing home where she'd volunteered had experienced accidents with their medication schedules that Victoria had been the first to notice and report. But perhaps most shocking was the documentation of Victoria's behavior toward her own romantic partners. My mother had somehow obtained statements from 3 of Victoria's ex-boyfriends detailing a pattern of psychological manipulation, deliberate sabotage of their professional relationships, and calculated cruelty designed to isolate them from friends and family. David Chen, whom Victoria had dated for 2 years in her mid-20s, had provided a particularly detailed account of how she'd systematically destroyed his friendships by sharing private information he'd confided in her, then comforting him when those friendships fell apart due to her betrayals. "She had this way of making you completely dependent on her," his statement read. "She'd create the problems, then be the only person offering solutions. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd lost most of my support system and genuinely believed I couldn't function without her help." Marcus's name appeared in the final section, with a note from my mother, "Current investigation ongoing. Marcus Hamilton appears to be following the same pattern as previous partners, with increasing isolation from family and friends since marriage began." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just enabling Victoria's behavior, he was likely another victim of her systematic manipulation. The awkward discomfort I'd attributed to guilt over Emma's assault might actually be the behavior of someone trapped in an abusive relationship, where reality was constantly being rewritten by a master manipulator. But it was the last document in the folder that broke my heart completely. It was a psychological evaluation, conducted privately by Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a forensic psychologist who specialized in personality disorders. My mother had apparently paid for the assessment herself, using the decades of documentation she'd compiled as evidence. Dr. Warren's conclusion was clinical and devastating. Based on the provided documentation spanning 23 years, Victoria Morrison Hamilton demonstrates a consistent pattern of behavior indicative of antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic features. Her systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals, combined with her sophisticated ability to manipulate adult perceptions and avoid consequences, suggests a level of calculated cruelty that poses a significant ongoing risk to others. The evaluation continued. Of particular concern is the subject's apparent escalation in recent years toward targeting children and elderly individuals, populations less able to advocate for themselves or be believed by protective adults. The incident involving her 7-year-old niece represents a concerning development in her pattern of abuse, suggesting decreased impulse control and increased willingness to harm family members when they interfere with her objectives. Dr. Warren had recommended immediate intervention and ongoing monitoring, particularly given Victoria's access to vulnerable populations through her charity work and family relationships. My phone rang, startling me out of the devastating revelations. It was my mother. "Did you read everything?" Her voice was gentle but strained. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I suspected when you were children, but I convinced myself I was overreacting. After your shoulder injury, I started paying closer attention and documenting incidents. By the time you were in high school, I knew what we were dealing with, but I didn't know how to protect you without destroying the family." The weight of her secret knowledge settled over me like a heavy blanket. For over 20 years, my mother had watched Victoria's escalating pattern of abuse, had documented every incident, had known exactly what my sister was capable of, and had said nothing. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out more wounded than angry. "Because I was a coward," she said simply. "I thought if I kept you away from her as much as possible, if I monitored the situation carefully, I could manage the risk without having to confront the truth about what she was. I was wrong. All those times Dad made excuses for her, all those family gatherings where I felt crazy for being afraid of my own sister. You were never crazy, Eliza. You were responding to a real threat that the rest of us were too afraid to acknowledge. I failed you then, and I almost failed Emma last Sunday. That's why I decided to stop protecting Victoria and start protecting the people she hurts. I thought about Emma, about the careful way she'd been moving since the wedding, about the fear in her eyes when she'd asked if Aunt Victoria hated her. My mother was right. We'd all failed Emma by allowing Victoria's pattern of abuse to continue unchallenged. What happens now? I asked. Now you have the information you need to make informed decisions about your family relationships, my mother said. Now you understand that what happened to Emma wasn't an isolated incident or a moment of wedding stress. It was the latest manifestation of a pattern that's been building for decades. The documentation spread across my living room floor represented more than just evidence of Victoria's cruelty. It was proof that my perceptions had been accurate, that my fear had been justified, that my instinct to protect Emma had been absolutely necessary. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't questioning my own judgment or wondering if I was overreacting. I was finally seeing the complete picture of who my sister really was and what she was capable of. There's one more thing, my mother said. I've been in contact with the Children's Hospital Foundation about Victoria's employment. They'll be conducting their own investigation based on the documentation I've provided. Her access to vulnerable children through her work is about to be significantly restricted. The systematic dismantling of Victoria's carefully constructed life was already in motion. The professional reputation she'd built on the backs of the people she'd secretly harmed was about to crumble under the weight of documented truth. She's going to blame me for all of this, I said. Let her, my mother replied firmly. The time for protecting Victoria from the consequences of her choices is over. The only people we should be protecting now are the ones she's hurt and the ones she might hurt in the future. After the call ended, I sat surrounded by 23 years of evidence, finally understanding the full scope of what Emma and I had been up against. But more than that, I understood that we weren't alone anymore. The secrets that had protected Victoria were finally being used to protect her victims instead. And that changed everything. The first crack in Victoria's carefully constructed world appeared on Friday morning when her boss called an emergency meeting. By noon, the news had reached our family through my Aunt Margaret's frantic phone call. Eliza, something terrible is happening, she said, her voice shaking with confusion and fear. Victoria's been suspended from her job pending some kind of investigation. They're saying there are questions about her conduct with the children's programs. This has to be connected to what happened at the wedding, doesn't it? The dominoes were falling exactly as my mother had predicted. The Children's Hospital Foundation had acted swiftly once presented with Dr. Warren's psychological evaluation and the documented pattern of Victoria's behavior around vulnerable populations. 23 years of evidence was difficult to dismiss, even for an organization that had previously praised Victoria's dedication. But Victoria wasn't going down quietly. She arrived at my house at 2:17 p.m. in a fury unlike anything I'd ever seen from her. Not the cold, calculated cruelty I was used to, but raw, desperate rage from someone watching their life disintegrate in real time. I opened the door to find her standing on my porch in wrinkled clothes, her usually perfect hair hanging in limp strands around her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wild, and she was clutching her phone like a weapon. "You destroyed my life," she said without preamble, pushing past me into my living room. "I know it was you and that psycho mother of ours." Emma was at her friend Madison's house for a playdate, thank God. I'd learned from my mother's example to think several steps ahead when dealing with Victoria. "Victoria, you need to leave, now. I'm not going anywhere until you fix this." She spun around to face me, and I saw something in her expression that made me step backward instinctively. "I lost my job today, Eliza. 7 years of building my career gone because of lies you told about me." "I didn't tell anyone anything," I said carefully, keeping my voice level. "If there's an investigation at your work, it's because of your own actions." "My own actions?" Her laugh was bitter and unhinged. "What actions? Being successful? Working harder than everyone else? Caring about children's causes?" The revisionist history was breathtaking, even for Victoria. She'd somehow convinced herself that her systematic manipulation and abuse of vulnerable populations was actually evidence of her dedication and caring nature. "Victoria, I've seen the documentation. I know what you've been doing for years." Her face went pale, then flushed red with rage. "What documentation? What are you talking about?" I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week ago. Instead of deflecting or minimizing or trying to manage her emotional state, I told her the truth. "Mom has been documenting your behavior for over 20 years. Every incident, every victim, every pattern of abuse you thought you'd gotten away with. She has medical records, police reports, witness statements, professional evaluations, everything." Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish drowning in air. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she was completely speechless. "That's impossible," she finally whispered. "There's no documentation because nothing happened. I've never hurt anyone. I've spent my whole life helping people." The depth of her self-deception was staggering. Even confronted with the reality of her situation, she was clinging to her false narrative with desperate intensity. "You pushed Emma into a marble pillar at your own wedding," I said quietly. "That happened 3 days ago in front of 300 witnesses. It's on security footage." "That was an accident. She was in my way." "You grabbed David Chen's house keys and had copies made so you could move his things around and make him think he was losing his mind. You admitted it to me at Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago like it was a funny story." Victoria's face crumpled with confusion, as if she couldn't understand how her casual admission of psychological torture was now being used as evidence against her. That was just... David was being dramatic about everything. I was trying to help him see that he was overreacting." "You served Jennifer Walsh food that contained peanuts after she specifically told you about her allergy during sorority rush. She almost died, Victoria." "That was a mistake. I mixed up the dietary restrictions." Each denial came faster and more desperate than the last. Victoria was cycling through every explanation she'd used over the years, every excuse she'd perfected, every manipulation she'd employed to escape consequences. But something had changed in the dynamic between us. For the first time in our relationship, her explanations weren't working on me. I wasn't questioning my perceptions or doubting my memories or trying to find ways to excuse her behavior. "Stop lying," I said simply. "I know who you are. I've always known, but now I have proof. The game is over, Victoria." She stared at me with something approaching shock, as if she couldn't process the fact that her lifelong victim was no longer accepting her version of reality. "You're jealous," she said suddenly, grasping for a new strategy. "You've always been jealous of my success, my relationships, my life. That's what this is really about." The accusation would have devastated me a week ago. I would have spent hours analyzing my motivations, wondering if she was right, trying to prove to myself and everyone else that my concerns were legitimate rather than petty sibling rivalry. But armed with 2 decades of documentation proving that my fears had been justified all along, her manipulation attempt just sounded pathetic. "I'm not jealous of someone who hurts children," I said. "I'm not jealous of someone who psychologically tortures their romantic partners. I'm not jealous of someone who builds their career by sabotaging programs for vulnerable people." Victoria's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at it and her face went even paler. "It's Marcus," she said, her voice small and frightened. "He's been getting calls all day from people asking about me. His law firm is concerned about the negative publicity affecting their reputation." Even her husband, the man she'd systematically isolated and manipulated for years, was beginning to distance himself as the truth about her behavior became public. "Victoria, you need professional help," I said, feeling something approaching pity for the first time in decades. "The psychological evaluation Dr. Warren conducted." "What psychological evaluation?" The words came out as a shriek. "Who the hell is Dr. Warren? You can't just have people evaluated without their consent." "You can when there's a pattern of behavior that suggests ongoing risk to vulnerable populations," I explained, remembering my mother's careful explanation of the legal protocols. "Especially when that person works with children and has documented access to potential victims." Victoria sank onto my couch as if her legs had given out. For the first time since we were children, she looked genuinely defeated rather than strategically vulnerable. "This isn't happening," she mumbled to herself. "This can't be happening. I'm a good person. I help people. I donated thousands of dollars to charity last year alone." The cognitive dissonance was almost painful to witness. Victoria had built her entire identity around being the successful, generous, caring sister, and the evidence of her true nature was shattering that carefully constructed self-image. Her phone rang again. This time she answered it, her voice trembling. "Hi, Marcus. No, I'm at Eliza's. What do you mean, more calls? Who called the partners at your firm? No, I don't know what they're talking about." I could hear Marcus's voice through the phone, tense and increasingly agitated. He was asking about incidents she'd never told him about, behavior patterns he was just now learning about through the professional network gossip that was apparently spreading like wildfire through their social circles. "Marcus, you have to believe me," Victoria pleaded into the phone. "None of this is true. It's all lies and exaggerations and—" "What do you mean the incident with Emma makes more sense now?" Even Marcus, isolated and manipulated as he'd been, was beginning to see Victoria's behavior toward Emma in the context of a larger pattern. The wedding assault wasn't looking like an isolated moment of stress anymore. It was looking like the latest manifestation of someone with a history of calculated cruelty. "I have to go," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the phone. "The senior partners want to meet with me Monday morning about how this situation might affect the firm's reputation. I need time to think." Victoria stared at her phone after he hung up, her face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something approaching genuine fear. "He doesn't believe me," she whispered. "My own husband doesn't believe me." "Because the evidence is overwhelming," I said gently. "Because once people start connecting the dots, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore." She looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen from her before, genuine vulnerability mixed with dawning recognition of her situation. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, and for a moment she sounded like the lost child she might have been before whatever had twisted her into the person she'd become. "Get help," I said. "Real help. Accept responsibility for what you've done and work toward understanding why you do it." "But my career, my reputation, Marcus, are all consequences of choices you made," I finished. "No one did this to you, Victoria. You did this to yourself by hurting people for decades and thinking you'd never have to face accountability." My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Victoria's lawyer just called the FBI field office demanding to know the legal basis for our investigation. Apparently she's realized this isn't just family drama anymore. Victoria saw me reading the message and lunged for my phone. "What does that say? What's she planning now?" I pulled the phone away from her reach, She's planning to make sure you can't hurt anyone else the way you hurt Emma. I didn't hurt Emma, it was an accident. Even now, facing the complete destruction of her life, Victoria couldn't admit the truth about what she'd done to a 7-year-old child. The psychological evaluation had been right. She was fundamentally incapable of genuine remorse or accountability. "Get out of my house," I said quietly. "Don't come back. Don't contact Emma. Don't contact me. If you want to salvage anything from this situation, start by staying away from the people you've hurt." Victoria stood up shakily, her face cycling through rage, desperation, and calculation as she searched for some angle, some manipulation, some way to regain control of the narrative. "This isn't over," she said finally. "I'm going to fight this. I'm going to prove that you and Mom are lying about everything. I'm going to expose this whole conspiracy." "Good luck with that," I said, opening the front door. "But you'll be fighting documented evidence, not family loyalty this time." After she left, I double-locked the door and called my mother. "She was just here," I reported. "It's getting ugly." "I expected it would," my mother replied calmly. "Cornered predators are always dangerous. But Victoria's running out of options. Her employer has suspended her. Her husband is questioning everything he thought he knew about her. And her reputation in professional circles is collapsing as the documentation spreads." "What about the legal side?" "Her lawyer is demanding access to the evidence against her, which means she's finally taking this seriously. But demanding access to evidence isn't the same as being able to refute it. 23 years of documentation from multiple independent sources is difficult to explain away." Through my living room window, I watched Victoria sit in her car in my driveway for almost 10 minutes. Presumably making phone calls or trying to figure out her next move. When she finally drove away, her tires squealed against the pavement with unnecessary force. Emma came home an hour later, full of stories about her playdate and blissfully unaware of the confrontation that had just occurred in our living room. As I helped her with homework and listened to her chatter about her friend's new puppy, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to Victoria. I felt safe. Not because Victoria had suddenly become less dangerous, but because she was no longer operating in the shadows. Her pattern of behavior was now documented. Her victims were no longer isolated. And her ability to manipulate family loyalty to escape consequences had been systematically dismantled. The war wasn't over. Victoria's parting threat made that clear. But for the first time in our lifelong conflict, I was fighting from a position of strength, rather than constantly defending against calculated attacks from someone everyone else refused to see clearly. Emma deserved that protection. She deserved to grow up without having to learn the survival skills I developed to navigate Victoria's cruelty. And maybe, finally, she wouldn't have to. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, but the weight of justice felt enormous as I sat in the gallery watching Victoria face real consequences for the first time in her life. It was 3 weeks after her desperate visit to my house, and the legal machinery had moved with surprising efficiency once the FBI's documentation had been formally submitted to the district attorney's office. Victoria sat at the defendant's table in a conservative navy suit that couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes or the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. Her high-powered attorney, paid for with the emergency loan Marcus had reluctantly co-signed before filing for separation, was making his final argument for a suspended sentence. "Your Honor, my client is a respected member of the community with no prior criminal record. This was an isolated incident during a high-stress family event, and Mrs. Morrison Hamilton has expressed genuine remorse for her actions." But Judge Patricia Reynolds had spent the morning reviewing Dr. Warren's psychological evaluation and listening to testimony from 3 of Victoria's former victims, who'd finally found the courage to speak publicly. Jennifer Walsh, now 28 and working as a pediatric nurse, had described the psychological trauma of her near-fatal allergic reaction during college and the years of anxiety that followed. David Chen had testified about the systematic psychological manipulation that had destroyed his confidence and isolated him from his support network. And most powerfully, Carlos Rodriguez, the janitor who'd overheard Victoria's cruel comments about the children's literacy programs, had explained how her sabotage had denied educational resources to dozens of underprivileged kids. "Mr. Patterson," Judge Reynolds addressed Victoria's lawyer with the sharp precision of someone who'd seen too many repeat offenders, Your client's expression of remorse rings hollow when examined against a documented pattern spanning over 2 decades. This was not an isolated incident. It was the latest manifestation of systematic predatory behavior. She shuffled through the thick file before her, and I recognized my mother's meticulous organization in the way the documents were arranged. The evidence presented by the FBI indicates that Mrs. Morrison Hamilton has consistently targeted vulnerable individuals, children, elderly persons, disabled individuals, and those in emotional distress, for calculated acts of cruelty disguised as accidents or helpful interventions. Victoria's face crumpled as the judge continued, but I noticed she was looking at the gallery rather than at Judge Reynolds, as if she was performing grief rather than experiencing it. The victim impact statements paint a clear picture of someone who derives satisfaction from causing pain while maintaining plausible deniability. This represents a level of premeditation and psychological manipulation that poses an ongoing threat to community safety. The judge turned directly to Victoria. "Mrs. Morrison Hamilton, do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Victoria stood slowly, her lawyer whispering urgent instructions in her ear. When she spoke, her voice carried the same calculated vulnerability she'd perfected as a child. "Your Honor, I never intended to hurt anyone, especially not my own niece. I've dedicated my career to helping children and vulnerable populations. I think there's been a misunderstanding about my character and motivations." Even now, facing criminal sentencing, she couldn't admit what she'd done. The judge's expression hardened. "Mrs. Morrison Hamilton, this court has reviewed extensive documentation of your behavior patterns, including video evidence of the assault on your 7-year-old niece. Your continued refusal to accept responsibility only reinforces the psychological evaluation's conclusion that you lack the capacity for genuine remorse." Judge Reynolds closed the file with finality. "On the charge of assault in the 3rd degree, I sentence you to 6 months in county jail, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. You are prohibited from contact with the minor victim and her family. Additionally, you are banned from employment or volunteer work involving children, elderly persons, or other vulnerable populations." The gavel came down with a sound that echoed through my chest like a heartbeat. Victoria's carefully composed mask finally cracked, and she turned toward the gallery with naked rage in her eyes, searching for someone to blame for her situation. Her gaze found mine, and for a moment we stared at each other across the courtroom, the sister who'd spent decades perfecting the art of cruelty, and the sister who'd finally found the courage to stop enabling it. "This is all your fault," she mouthed silently, tears streaming down her face. But the words didn't hurt anymore. They were just the desperate accusation of someone who'd never learned to take responsibility for her choices. My mother appeared at my elbow as the bailiff led Victoria away in handcuffs. "How do you feel?" she asked quietly. "Empty," I said honestly. "Not happy, not sad, just empty. Like the fear I've been carrying around for 30 years finally has somewhere to go." Emma was staying with my father for the day, a carefully supervised visit now that he understood the full scope of Victoria's behavior and his role in enabling it. The documentation my mother had compiled hadn't just exposed Victoria. It had forced our entire family to confront their complicity in her pattern of abuse. My father's transformation had been particularly dramatic. The man who'd spent decades making excuses for Victoria's cruelty had become her harshest critic once he understood how his protection had enabled her to harm others. He'd testified for the prosecution, describing incidents he'd witnessed and minimized over the years, with a shame that aged him visibly. "I failed you," he'd told me after his testimony. "I failed Emma. I failed every person Victoria hurt, because I was too concerned with family reputation to face the truth about what she was." Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Victoria's case had attracted media attention due to her high-profile charity work and the unusual involvement of FBI documentation in a family assault case. I walked past them without comment, but my mother paused to make a brief statement. "This case demonstrates that patterns of abuse don't exist in isolation," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her federal position. "When communities fail to protect vulnerable individuals from systematic predators, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate victims. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice delivered sends a clear message about our collective values." The reporters shouted questions about federal involvement in family disputes and the ethics of using FBI resources for personal cases, but my mother simply walked away. She'd already submitted to an internal review of her actions and had been cleared of any wrongdoing. The determination that Victoria posed a genuine threat to vulnerable populations had justified the use of federal resources to document her pattern of behavior. 6 months later, Emma and I were planting flowers in our backyard when she asked the question I'd been dreading. "Mommy, when Aunt Victoria gets out of jail, will she come to see us?" I set down my gardening trowel and looked at my daughter, who was carefully placing purple pansies in the soil with the same focused attention she'd once given to her flower girl duties. The physical injuries from the wedding had healed completely, but the emotional recovery had been more complex. "No, sweetheart," I said gently. "Aunt Victoria isn't allowed to visit us anymore. The judge made a rule that she has to stay away so we can feel safe." Emma nodded solemnly. "Good," she said simply, then returned to her planting. The casualness of her response spoke volumes about how much our lives had improved since Victoria's removal from them. Emma slept through the night again. She played with enthusiasm rather than careful watchfulness. She asked for playdates and sleepovers without the anxiety that had previously accompanied social situations. Most importantly, she'd stopped asking if she'd done something wrong when adults were upset or stressed. The hypervigilance that Victoria's presence had created in our family dynamics was finally fading. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Divorce, finalized today. Thank you for helping me see the truth. I'm sorry it took so long." Marcus had filed for divorce 2 weeks after Victoria's sentencing, finally acknowledging that his marriage had been built on manipulation and psychological control rather than genuine partnership. With Victoria in jail, he'd been able to access counseling and begin understanding how systematically she'd isolated him from friends and family. The man who'd seemed weak and complicit at the wedding had revealed himself to be another victim of Victoria's calculated cruelty. He'd been experiencing what therapists called intimate partner psychological abuse, a pattern of control and manipulation that had left him doubting his own perceptions and dependent on Victoria's version of reality. "Seishin, he's one of the lucky ones," Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the family therapist Emma and I had been seeing, had explained. "Many victims of psychological abuse never recognize what happened to them because the manipulation is so subtle and systematic." Emma and I had both been in therapy since the wedding, working through decades of family dysfunction and learning to trust our own perceptions again. For Emma, it was about understanding that adults should protect children, not hurt them. For me, it was about unlearning the survival mechanisms I'd developed to navigate Victoria's cruelty. "You've spent your whole life walking on eggshells," Dr. Mitchell had told me during one of our sessions. "Learning to live without that constant hypervigilance is going to take time." She was right. Even months after Victoria's incarceration, I still found myself bracing for emotional attacks that weren't coming, analyzing conversations for hidden meanings that weren't there, and preparing defensive strategies for conflicts that would never materialize. But slowly, gradually, I was learning to inhabit a world where Victoria's cruelty was no longer a constant threat. My relationship with my parents had transformed as well. My father, devastated by his role in enabling Victoria's behavior, had thrown himself into making amends with almost desperate intensity. He'd started therapy, joined a support group for families affected by personality disorders, and became Emma's most protective advocate. "I know I can't undo the damage," he'd told me recently, "but I can make sure it never happens again." My mother had returned to her FBI duties with renewed purpose, using her experience with Victoria's case to develop new protocols for investigating family violence and systematic abuse patterns. She'd become a sought-after expert on the intersection of personality disorders and criminal behavior. "Your sister taught me something important about the nature of predators," she'd explained. "They often hide in plain sight, using social respectability and family connections to access victims and avoid accountability. We're developing new training programs to help investigators recognize these patterns." Victoria's victims had formed an unexpected support network. Jennifer Walsh had reached out to other former sorority members who'd experienced accidents around Victoria. David Chen had connected with Victoria's other ex-boyfriends to compare experiences and validate their recovered memories of psychological manipulation. Even Carlos Rodriguez, the janitor whose testimony had been so powerful, had started speaking at conferences about the importance of believing service workers who witness abuse in institutional settings. "She took pieces of all of us," Jennifer had said during a victim impact meeting we'd attended, "but sharing our experiences has helped us reclaim those pieces." The most surprising development had been the response from Victoria's former employer. The Children's Hospital Foundation had conducted a comprehensive review of all the programs Victoria had been involved with, discovering millions of dollars in mysterious budget shortfalls and program failures that could now be attributed to her systematic sabotage. Rather than trying to cover up the scandal, they'd used Victoria's case as an opportunity to implement new oversight protocols and victim reporting systems. They'd established a whistleblower protection program and hired additional staff specifically trained to recognize signs of internal sabotage. "We failed the children we serve by not recognizing the threat within our own organization," the foundation's director had said in a public statement. "We're committed to ensuring this never happens again." Victoria herself had served her full 6-month sentence without incident. According to the correctional officers who'd supervised her, she'd been a model prisoner. Quiet, compliant, and focused on maintaining her appearance and reading legal documents. But the reports from her mandatory therapy sessions told a different story. Despite months of court-ordered counseling, she continued to maintain that she was the victim of a family conspiracy, and that her actions had been misunderstood or taken out of context. She demonstrates no genuine insight into her behavior patterns or empathy for her victims, her prison psychologist had written in the final evaluation. The prognosis for meaningful behavioral change is poor. Victoria would be released next month to begin her probation period, but she'd be monitored closely and prohibited from contact with any of her identified victims. More importantly, she'd be entering a world where her reputation had been permanently destroyed, and her access to vulnerable populations had been systematically eliminated. As Emma and I finished planting our garden, I thought about the difference between justice and revenge. Revenge would have been about making Victoria suffer the way she'd made others suffer. Justice was about removing her ability to cause future harm while giving her victims the validation and protection they deserved. The flowers we were planting would bloom next spring, long after Victoria's release from jail. Emma would see them grow and flourish in soil we'd prepared together, in a garden where she felt safe to play and dream and simply be a child. That evening, as I tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at me with those wise brown eyes that had seen too much but were learning to trust again. "Mommy, I'm glad Grandma Sarah is so good at her job," she said sleepily. "Me too, baby, me too." After Emma fell asleep, I sat in my living room reading the final report from Dr. Warren about Victoria's psychological evaluation. The clinical language couldn't capture the emotional journey we'd all taken, but it provided a framework for understanding what we'd survived. Individuals with antisocial personality disorder often function successfully in society by exploiting social institutions and family dynamics that prioritize harmony over accountability, Dr. Warren had written. Breaking these protective patterns requires courage, documentation, and institutional support. This case demonstrates that with proper intervention, even sophisticated predators can be held accountable for their actions. The report concluded with recommendations for ongoing monitoring and victim support, but also with something I hadn't expected: hope. While the perpetrator shows little capacity for genuine change, the family system has demonstrated remarkable resilience in breaking generational patterns of abuse and establishing healthier protective dynamics. The minor victim appears to be recovering well with appropriate support, and the family's commitment to truth over harmony suggests a positive long-term prognosis. A positive long-term prognosis. After 34 years of navigating Victoria's cruelty, those words felt like a gift. My phone rang, and I saw my mother's name on the screen. "How was your day?" she asked, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Peaceful," I said, and meant it. Emma and I planted flowers. "She's sleeping through the night consistently now. We're okay, Mom. We're actually okay." "You're more than okay," she said firmly. "You're free. And Emma's gonna grow up understanding that adults should protect children, not harm them." That's a gift you gave her by refusing to accept Victoria's behavior as normal. After we hung up, I walked through my house, checking locks and turning off lights. Rituals of security that felt comforting rather than fearful now. In Emma's room, I could hear her breathing deeply. No longer the fitful sleep of a traumatized child, but the peaceful rest of someone who felt genuinely safe. The wedding seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 7 months. The sight of Emma hitting that marble floor, the sound of Victoria's callous laughter, the family's immediate rush to minimize and excuse. All of it had led to this moment of quiet peace in a house where cruelty was no longer welcome. Justice had been served, healing was happening, and Emma would grow up knowing that her pain mattered, her voice would be heard, and the adults in her life would move mountains to protect her. That was worth every difficult conversation, every legal proceeding, every family relationship that had been forever changed by our insistence on truth over comfortable lies. As I turned off the last light and headed to bed, I smiled at the thought of our garden in spring, Emma's flowers blooming in soil we'd prepared together, in a world where she was finally truly safe. The age of consequence had ended Victoria's reign of terror. The age of healing had begun. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.